The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to the 64th Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is still with us, Jacob. Here you are, 2 weeks on, you are still leader of the House, and we are still doing the Moggcast with you as leader of the House. How do you feel about it?
Well, I'm very glad to be leader of the House. I enjoy being leader of the House, and I think this government has great opportunities ahead of it. So I was a bit worried when you said I was still with you. I don't think my health is that poor. I was hoping to survive the week, and I started the Moggcast before I got into government. I started as a backbencher.
But if you'd been whisked off to trade, we would never have seen you again because you'd be in an airplane all the time like Penny Mordaunt. Or if you'd been disappeared into the bowels of the Treasury, we might never have seen you again either. So we're delighted you're here. I did ask you this at the start because before the shuffle, you ventured into the Sunday Express to give your views on tax, and you've given your views on tax to us before, and you've reminded the world that the older George Bush said, read my lips, no new taxes, and taxes went up. I'm just asking this, but do you have a certain licence from the Prime Minister to disagree and stir it up? Because you're still here, having caused a certain number of public waves.
Well, I didn't think they were very noticeable waves, really. Though I enjoy doing my weekly wisdom for the Sunday Express. I've been doing it for some years now, and Helena, my wife, points out to me that it really is as much as I can manage to be wise once a week. Nonetheless, I try my best. Collective responsibility requires you to support the policy as it exists. And the policy isn't changed until it's changed. And sometimes policy has to change for very good reasons. But collective responsibility requires you not to be a soothsayer.
Quite. I mean, so does political tact and management. But I'm just pointing out, in case you hadn't noticed, that you've not been afraid from time to time just to make your views known in advance of a decision.
Well, collective responsibility, as I say, is about supporting the decisions that have been made by the government. But inevitably, views are debated, that there's not some sort of monolithic programming of ministers to make them all think exactly the same thing before decisions are made. But ministers have to be supportive of the manifesto and have to support policy once it is announced. I mean, you inevitably read bits in newspapers which say Minister X or Minister Y has said whatever Minister X or Y has said, and these briefings go on and one never knows quite who they're from. I occasionally say something in a bit of weekly wisdom, but it's not much different, really.
Now, just touching for a minute on former ministers, who by definition aren't there anymore, though you're still there. There isn't a full government list up yet on the website, but there is a list of the ministers who've been appointed so far and who've been dismissed so far. By my count, 13 Commons ministers have gone. Do you happen to know off the top of your head, because I've done a count, how many of them are men of those 13?
No, I don't. I haven't counted.
12 of the 13 are men, which is going to lead me to my next question. I mean, baked into cabinet shuffles these days, and ministerial shuffles too, is the assumption, not an unreasonable one, that one must promote more women, more ethnic minority members, and now, just to complicate the mix still further, MPs who represent the red wall. I mean, has all this, certainly a number of our readers would think so, what they regard as identity politics gone too far, and shouldn't we go back to a simple system of appointment on merit?
Well, I think I'd actually dispute your premise, because I think there's one thing you're missing out, and that is if you go back to earlier parliaments, the proportion of men was much, much higher than the proportion of women. And that inevitably, when you have reshuffles, the people who tend to leave government are those who have been in Parliament the longest. Not invariably, but as a general rule. And the people who've entered Parliament are more balanced between men and women. And therefore you would expect that those who've been around longer leave for whatever reason, and those who come in are newer, and the balance of the newer parliaments is a more even one.
Though the Prime Minister himself doesn't seem to make any secret that it's an aim of the reshuffle to promote more women and ethnic minority members, does he?
I mean, you and I remember John Major's first cabinet, which didn't have a single woman in it. And this was seen even in 1990 to be an extraordinary way to construct a government. And there is, I think, a reasonable ambition that the cabinet, that office, should be representative of Parliament and the country at large, so that you bring in differing views, you bring in differing experiences, rather than having a single viewpoint.
So I'm just saying that our readers would say, rather than go through this process by which you have determined from the start that even if, as you say, there are more women or ethnic minority MPs, rather than go from the start through a process that says we're determined to promote more, you should simply promote on merit.
I think the promotions are on merit. And I think the people who have been promoted are very high quality, capable individuals. And it's very difficult in a reshuffle because people do go out of office, people who are also exceptionally good and able. And that is the hard choice that a Prime Minister has to make.
Are you involved at all in the formal process on reshuffle day as Leader of the House, or is that not really a matter for you?
No, it's not a matter for me. I find out what is happening to me in the same way as everybody else. If you're a minister, your private office tells you when you are required to see the Prime Minister.
I want to go on to the rather complicated story of Anglo-French relations in the light of the new security arrangement with Australia and America. What do you feel about the current attitude of the French government, almost regardless of this, to the UK? Because in some respects, France is a key ally. It's a key defence and security ally. In others, it's pretty fair to say the French have been very difficult over the protocol. And the Home Secretary has made it pretty clear that she doesn't think they're being cooperative over the Channel boats. What's your take?
My take is that there's an election in France next year, and that from a French point of view, winding up the British a little is usually electorally popular. That I think the British and the French have a wonderful relationship, a very close one, but one of good-spirited competitiveness. And in their competitive nature, I think the French like to say things that they think will wind us up. But to use a French term, the British are very good at showing sang-froid, and that we don't get frightfully wound up. That is our sort of means of retaliation. But I agree with your fundamental point. We have a very close defence relationship with France, a very important one. And I thought you had a brilliant piece. I often think you have brilliant pieces in your paper, in your, not paper, is it? Because it's not actually printed, unless very old-fashioned people, even more old-fashioned than I am, printed out physically to read it. But let's call it a paper for the sake of colloquialism, explaining that global Britain needs to concentrate on European security as well as security in the Pacific. And we have to do both. And of course we have to do both because we're a maritime nation, we have global interests, it's where our history leads us. But it's understandable that continental nations should think that our whole focus should be on continental security. And I do think that one of the freedoms of being outside the European Union is that we can act without consulting the EU on what we're going to do, without undermining our commitment to European security. And you mentioned the 800 soldiers that we have in Estonia, which I think is a really important commitment. As you say, perhaps more symbolic, but nonetheless, through its symbolism, very powerful. So our relationship with France is very important, and we should accept a little bit of garlic eating in return for the benefits of having a close relationship.
You're saying that were it not election year, Macron might not be carrying on like this about the protocol or even about the boats.
I think the withdrawing of ambassadors is rather a high-profile symbol rather than a desire to counsel relations with the US and Australia. And bear in mind, as I think you pointed out, he withdrew his ambassador from Italy at one point. This is all the fun of diplomacy.
Do you think, you must think there's rather more to them not withdrawing their ambassador from the UK than the suggestion from French ministers and others that the UK is really beneath their level of notice?
I thought that was a rather good line, actually. I was rather clever, rather sensible of the President of France to try and undermine our self-confidence. It doesn't work. I don't mind if the President of France wishes to say that his ambassador in the UK is so unimportant to him that he doesn't mind whether she's here or not. I think it's rather offensive to her, actually. It rather indicates that she's not taking much notice of.
What do you think the real reason is why they've not withdrawn their ambassador to the UK? You presumably don't agree that's the reason, even if they're saying that it is.
I think it's a great reason. I love the fact they're saying this. I think they're trying to wind us up and we're not rising to the bait. Why would we?
Talking of winding people up and rising to the bait and so on. The spending review, as the reshuffle came just before the spending review, which is arguably convenient to the Treasury because they have to deal with a whole series of rookie ministers who come in and find there are spending bids that they themselves didn't agree. Arguably it isn't. Do you think it's would be reasonable for the Treasury to say to the spending departments, right, we've had the bids in from your predecessor Secretary of State, that's it, you're going to have to work on the basis of those bids?
Again, I've seen you've written that. I think the difficulty with that is that the bids may be much higher than the Treasury wants. So simply accepting the bid of the previous Secretary of State may mean it's rather expensive. And I have a feeling that it's going to be necessary to be quite strict and ensure that money is very well spent. I think the Chancellor has asked each department to try and find savings, as you would expect a Chancellor to do. And I think you might find that that the Treasury needs to push hard. Spending ministries always want to spend.
Of course, if the bids are still open, that would give the minister in the spending department, he or she might not be wise to do it, but would give them the chance to try to push the figure up from the figure that their predecessor had been pushing.
I hope that ministers will listen to the Prime Minister's message that we are working to one single purpose. And the success of the government is as a whole, not as a combination of parts. And this means that we have to live within our means. It is not a sign of ministerial virility that you get more money out of the Treasury when the country is running a large budget deficit. We have to make sure that public expenditure is done carefully and prudently and is not wasteful, and that must be the overriding watchwords for Secretaries of State. And it is a coming together rather than trying to say, well, my department's got more money than your department and I've got certificates to prove it, which, if you remember, was an advert for national savings certificates from, gosh, I think the early 1970s. I think it was, my daddy's got more money than your daddy and he's got certificates to prove it.
Just before that lighter note at the end, that all sounded pretty stern. You're not volunteering to become a member of the Star Chamber, are you?
No, I'm not volunteering to do anything, no. The Court of Star Chamber was abolished, of course, after the Civil War. The prerogative courts. I mean, this is a complete aside, as you know.
I mean, there have been lots of vulgarly known as Star Chamber proceedings since with, Ken Clarke, I think, under the coalition, used to sit on the Star Chamber and beat up members of other spending departments who he knew from his Treasury days were not, by his light, being reasonable.
Can you imagine me beating anybody up? I mean, really?
Just about. I can see that it would happen. Just sort of two final questions. I mean, one is, can you guarantee, I mean, is the government in a position to guarantee that the lights will stay on this winter and we won't be going back to a 3-day week?
Yes.
And the final question, since you've guaranteed it's a question of a quite different kind. I mean, were you surprised? You were there gathered round the cabinet table last week and we've been released a certain amount of what the Prime Minister said. And I'm sure you were paying attention very carefully, but one's mind does drift off. Were you surprised to find the Prime Minister making a reference to the number of children you've had? And indeed to the number of children he's had?
No, not at all. I did see that reported. I have 6, and that is probably it. So the Prime Minister and I think, are even Stevens at the moment. So if it were a competition, I would be falling behind. I would have to have words with Helena.
Well, as you say, as far as we know, you and the Prime Minister are even Stevens. I'm saying that without casting any aspersions on either of you. It's been a pleasure to do another Moggcast. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure, and I hope we can do one at the party conference.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.